Benjamin Siegel was born on February 28, 1906, in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood that seemed built from struggle itself. The tenements groaned under the weight of too many families and too little hope. The air smelled of coal smoke and bread crusts, and every street corner was ruled by boys who learned early that fists spoke louder than words. Ben was one of those boys, restless, sharp-eyed, with a dangerous sort of charm that drew people in and made them nervous all at once. He didn't want to be another poor kid living and dying in Brooklyn's gutters. He wanted out, and more than that, he wanted everything. His parents were immigrants from Austria, tired souls who spent their days in endless labor just to put food on the table. His father worked in a factory. His mother scrubbed clothes for neighbors. They hoped their son might find a cleaner path, maybe go to school, maybe rise above the grime of the city. But Ben's eyes were already elsewhere. From a young age, he was fascinated not by school books, but by the power that came from fear. He watched older boys collect protection money from pushcart vendors, saw how one threat could earn more in a day than his father made in a week. It wasn't hard for him to understand where the real power lay. By his early teens, Ben was already running with a small gang of local kids. They were fearless, or maybe just too young to understand the meaning of fear. He started with petty theft, shaking down street vendors for nickels, stealing coal from trains, reselling stolen goods in alleyways. But even then, Ben wasn't content to follow. He was quick, brutal when needed, and clever enough to turn chaos to his advantage. People began to notice. They said the boy had something in his eyes, something wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. They started calling him Bugsy, a nickname born from the word bugs, meaning crazy. He hated it. To him, it sounded small and mocking, a reminder of the chaos he wanted to control, not become. But it stuck. The streets of New York in the 1920s were a breeding ground for men like Ben Siegel. Prohibition had turned the city into a playground for criminals, a golden age for anyone willing to risk prison, or a bullet, for money. Speakeasies flourished behind unmarked doors, and liquor flowed through the veins of the city like blood. There was more money than ever to be made, and those who had the nerve to take it were carving empires out of the lawless dark. Among them was a quiet, calculating boy named Meyer Lansky. Meyer wasn't like Ben. Where Ben was hot-headed and impulsive, Meyer was calm, analytical, a chess player in a world full of brawlers. When the two met, it was as if the streets themselves took notice. The fire and the mind had found each other. Their friendship began with small-time hustles. They started running protection rackets on pushcart vendors, offering safety from the very violence they themselves could unleash. Together they built a reputation for efficiency and brutality. Meyer would plan every move like a strategist, and Ben would carry it out with cold precision. They were teenagers, but they moved like men who already understood the rules of the underworld. It wasn't long before they formed their own gang, the Bugs and Meyer mob. In a city where Irish and Italian mobs ruled, a Jewish crew had to be twice as fierce just to survive. The Bugs and Meyer mob didn't just survive, they thrived. They specialized in enforcement, hired guns for whoever paid best. Their willingness to take on the dirtiest jobs made them indispensable to the bigger players. Murder, hijacking, bootlegging, it didn't matter. If someone needed a problem solved, and solved fast, they called Bugsy and Meyer. Ben Siegel became known for his violence. He was fast with his fists and faster with a gun. There was a story that once, when someone tried to cheat him during a card game, Ben didn't argue. He smiled, finished his drink, and walked the man outside. Moments later, there was a gunshot. Ben came back in, calm as ever, sat down and kept playing. It was that kind of fearlessness that made him both respected and terrifying. But beneath the violence, there was something else, a strange kind of charm that made people follow him. Women adored him, men feared him, and his enemies rarely got a second chance. By his early 20s, Siegel and Lansky's small gang had caught the attention of the city's rising mob leaders, especially Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano had a vision of uniting the fractured world of organized crime into a single, efficient network, a syndicate that would run crime like a business. To do that, he needed loyal men who could think beyond turf wars and personal vendettas. Lansky was his strategist, but Siegel was his weapon. Together, they helped Luciano eliminate the old bosses who stood in their way, paving the path for a new order in the criminal underworld. Ben was no longer a street kid. He was a soldier in a new kind of empire. The mob was changing, growing more sophisticated, more organized. Gone were the days of sloppy gang wars and back-alley hits. Luciano and his allies, Lansky, Siegel, and others, were building something that would reach into every corner of America. Bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, narcotics, nothing was off limits. And Siegel, with his combination of charm and ruthlessness, became one of their most valuable enforcers. He was also one of the most unpredictable. When he wasn't planning hits or collecting debts, Siegel was out living like a movie star. He loved fine clothes, fast cars, and beautiful women. He spent money like it was infinite, showering gifts on friends and lovers alike. Yet, even in his moments of indulgence, he carried the aura of danger. People who crossed him had a way of disappearing. His temper was legendary. One night, while sitting in a restaurant with friends, a man at a nearby table made a joke at his expense. Siegel stood smiling politely, walked over and slammed the man's head into the table until he went limp. Then, as if nothing happened, he returned to his seat and resumed his meal. No one dared say a word, but it wasn't all brutality. There was ambition too, something deeper that drove him beyond the criminal world. Siegel wasn't content to be just another mobster. He wanted to be someone remembered, someone whose name would echo through time. It was this hunger that made him dangerous even to his friends. By the early 1930s, Siegel had become one of the most feared and admired figures in the American underworld. The Commission, the new governing body of organized crime, was in full swing, and Siegel stood close to its core. He helped Luciano and Lansky shape policies, settle disputes, and keep the balance between rival factions. But New York was getting crowded. Every corner had its kings, and Siegel wanted his own kingdom. When the opportunity came to expand westward, he took it. The mob was looking for someone to oversee their interests in California, a land of sunshine, money, and movie stars. It was perfect for a man like Ben Siegel, who loved glamour as much as power. He packed his bags and headed for Los Angeles, a city where the rules were still being written and the line between legitimate business and organized crime was as thin as a palm leaf. In Los Angeles, Siegel became something new. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was a celebrity. He moved among Hollywood's elite, attending lavish parties, rubbing shoulders with actors, producers, and directors. He dated starlets, dressed in the finest suits, and bought a mansion in Beverly Hills. People were drawn to him, the dangerous charm, the whispered rumors of murder, the aura of a man who could order a hit in the morning and dine with movie stars by night. But beneath the glitter of his new life, Siegel was still the same street kid from Brooklyn, still hungry, still ruthless. He built rackets throughout California, taking control of gambling dens, bookmaking operations, and racetracks. He greased the palms of police officers and politicians, ensuring his empire ran smoothly. He also became involved in Hollywood's darker dealings, loan sharking, blackmail, extortion. If someone owed money or stepped out of line, Siegel handled it personally. Despite the violence that followed him, people couldn't help but be captivated. There was something magnetic about the contradiction he embodied, the elegance of a gentleman, the heart of a killer. His name was whispered in both fear and fascination. Bugsy Siegel had become a symbol of a new kind of gangster, modern, polished, and terrifyingly efficient. Still, deep down, he felt something missing. Power wasn't enough. Money wasn't enough. He wanted to build something that would last longer than bullets and reputation. Something permanent. Something that would make people remember him not just as a criminal, but as a creator. He wanted to leave a mark on the world that no one could erase. The whispers of opportunity came from the desert. Nevada, an empty stretch of sand with laws that favored gambling and quick marriages. Most saw it as nothing but dust and heat, a wasteland fit for wanderers and dreamers. But Siegel saw more. He saw a city waiting to be born. It was there, among the endless miles of sand and sky, that the next chapter of his life would begin, the chapter that would make him immortal. The desert would become his canvas, and he would build something no one had ever dared imagine. He didn't know yet that the very dream that drew him would also destroy him. But then again, Bugsy Siegel had never feared destruction. He had always been willing to burn everything to light his own way. And so, with the charm of a movie star and the heart of a killer, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel stood on the edge of something new, staring out across the endless horizon of Nevada, a place where his ambition would soon take root, and where the sands would one day bury him. Los Angeles in the 1930s shimmered with sunlight and secrets. Beneath the golden glow of palm trees and studio spotlights, the city was a paradise built on illusions. To the public, it was a land of movie stars, dreams, and endless opportunities. But behind the glitz, corruption thrived. Politicians took bribes, cops looked the other way, and the underworld pulsed quietly beneath the surface. For Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, it was the perfect place to reinvent himself. He wasn't just another New York gangster anymore. He was something grander, a man who could blend into Hollywood's high society. While still ruling the streets from the shadows, he arrived in Los Angeles with the confidence of a man who knew how to take what he wanted. The East Coast mob sent him to expand their influence, but Siegel had his own ambitions. He rented a house in Beverly Hills and quickly surrounded himself with movie stars, producers, and politicians. He was charming, magnetic, and dangerous, qualities that drew people in even when they knew better. He became friends with stars like Clark Gable, George Raft, and Cary Grant, men who lived their lives in front of cameras, but none of them could match the real-life charisma of the gangster from Brooklyn. In every room he entered, Bugsy was the center of gravity. He wore tailored suits and silk ties, smoked only the finest cigarettes, and carried himself like he owned the city. The Hollywood elite were both fascinated and terrified of him. He could make them laugh one moment and freeze their blood the next. He had a smile that could melt ice and eyes that could burn through steel. He didn't belong to their world, but he made it his own. Still, beneath the glamour, the old habits remained. Siegel began taking control of the gambling operations scattered across Southern California. Small backroom poker games, illegal betting houses, and private clubs all fell under his reach. He didn't just collect money, he created an empire. Using intimidation and persuasion in equal measure, he ensured that every card game and every horse bet in Los Angeles eventually paid tribute to him. And those who refused? They simply disappeared. He brought a new level of organization to the West Coast rackets. He paid off police officers and politicians, making sure raids never happened without his permission. He opened high-end gambling clubs disguised as private lounges where celebrities could play without fear of publicity. The profits rolled in, but Siegel was never satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted something bigger than the rackets, something that could set him apart from every gangster who came before him. In the middle of all this, there was Virginia Hill. She was beautiful, ambitious, and as dangerous in her own way as Bugsy himself. A former courier for the mob, Virginia had climbed her way into the highest circles of power through wit, charm, and manipulation. When Siegel met her, it was like two storms colliding. They fell into a relationship that was as intoxicating as it was volatile. They loved each other with the same intensity they fought with, passion and destruction bound tightly together. Virginia became Siegel's partner in both business and pleasure. She understood his hunger, his dreams, and his demons. Together they lived like royalty, lavish parties, expensive cars, fine art, and endless champagne. They hosted the biggest names in Hollywood, their home filled with laughter and whispers, but always shadowed by danger. Everyone knew that Bugsy Siegel was a man you didn't cross, yet for all his success, the old world back east was always watching. Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky kept tabs on him, waiting to see if he could turn Los Angeles into a gold mine for the syndicate. At first, they were impressed. The money was flowing, the police were silent, and the West Coast was thriving under Siegel's control. But as the years passed, rumors began to reach New York. Rumors of Siegel's temper, his arrogance, and his reckless spending. He wasn't just running rackets anymore. He was trying to become a legend. It was around this time that Siegel's attention turned toward the desert. Las Vegas was still a small town, a forgotten speck on the map with a few dusty casinos and a reputation for quick divorces. But something about it called to him. Maybe it was the isolation, the emptiness, or the endless space waiting to be filled. He saw potential where no one else did. He imagined building a place that would rival the great resorts of Europe, a playground for the rich, a city that would never sleep. At first, people laughed at him. Who would travel into the desert just to gamble? There was nothing there but sand and scorpions. But Siegel wasn't a man who accepted disbelief. He had the charm of a dreamer and the will of a conqueror. When he talked about his vision, even the skeptics began to listen. He described neon lights glowing against the night sky, casinos filled with music and laughter, luxury hotels rising from the dust. He called it the Flamingo, The name came from Virginia Hill's nickname, slender, fiery, and beautiful, just like the bird. Siegel convinced the mob to invest, promising enormous profits and a new frontier for their operations. Luciano, still imprisoned but maintaining his influence, gave his blessing. Meyer Lansky, cautious but loyal, supported him. Millions of dollars began flowing into the project. It was supposed to be simple: build a resort, open a casino, and watch the money pour in. But nothing about Siegel was simple. Construction on the Flamingo began in 1945, and from the very start, it was chaos. The desert heat was merciless, supplies were scarce, and the costs skyrocketed. Siegel demanded the best of everything: imported marble from Italy, French chefs, Egyptian cotton for the hotel rooms. He wanted it to be perfect, something no one had ever seen before. But perfection came with a price, and that price kept rising. The mob began to grow uneasy. What was supposed to cost $1 million had already tripled, and Siegel kept asking for more. He claimed the money was going into construction, but whispers spread that he was skimming from the project. The more the costs rose, the more suspicious his investors became. Still, Bugsy was undeterred. He had staked his reputation on the Flamingo, and failure was not an option. Meanwhile, his life in Los Angeles began to unravel. His violent temper grew worse, and his relationship with Virginia turned toxic. They fought constantly, their arguments echoing through their lavish home like thunder. There were rumors of infidelity, of money hidden overseas, of deals gone bad. The Hollywood crowd that once adored him began to pull away, sensing the danger that followed him everywhere. Even Meyer Lansky, his oldest friend, started to worry that Bugsy's ambition had crossed the line into madness. But Siegel didn't care. He was consumed by his vision. The Flamingo wasn't just a business project, it was his destiny. Every night he would stand in the desert, staring at the half-finished building, imagining the glow of neon lights and the sound of roulette wheels spinning. He believed that if he could finish it, if he could make this dream real, he would finally become more than just another gangster. He would become a legend. By late 1946, after years of delays and millions of dollars spent, the Flamingo was finally nearing completion. Siegel planned an opening that would make history, a celebration of luxury, elegance, and success. He sent invitations to Hollywood's biggest stars, promised entertainment from the finest performers, and prepared for the moment he believed would change everything. But the desert had other plans. When the Flamingo opened its doors on December 26, 1946, it was a disaster. Heavy rains flooded the roads, preventing guests from arriving. The casino's air conditioning failed, the rooms weren't finished, and the staff was unprepared. The few guests who did show up left unimpressed. Within days, the Flamingo was losing thousands of dollars. The dream that Siegel had promised turned into a nightmare. Back east, the mob bosses were furious. They had invested millions and seen nothing but failure. Rumors of theft and mismanagement swirled. Some said Siegel had stolen the money and hidden it in Swiss bank accounts. Others claimed he was too distracted by his Hollywood lifestyle to care about business. Whatever the truth was, his reputation was in freefall. For the first time in his life, Bugsy Siegel was losing control. The man who once commanded fear and respect was now surrounded by whispers of betrayal. Meyer Lansky tried to intervene, pleading with the others to give Siegel more time. He argued that the Flamingo could still turn a profit once it found its footing. But patience was a luxury the mob rarely afforded. Still, Siegel refused to give up. He poured every ounce of energy into saving the Flamingo, determined to prove everyone wrong. He believed that once people saw what he had built, they would understand. He wasn't just chasing money anymore. He was chasing immortality. The lights of Las Vegas were beginning to glow, faint but visible, and Siegel believed they would one day shine brighter than any star in Hollywood. He was right about that, but he would never live to see it. The failure of the Flamingo's opening night haunted Bugsy Siegel like a curse. The man who had once commanded rooms full of gangsters, movie stars, and millionaires now found himself standing alone in the Nevada desert, surrounded by half-finished walls and the echo of disappointment. The bright lights he had dreamed of flickered weakly against the sand, mocking him. The mob's money had vanished into this mirage of glass and marble, and every day that passed without profit tightened the noose around his neck. But Bugsy was not a man who surrendered. In the days after the disastrous opening, he roamed the Flamingo like a ghost, barking orders, firing staff, rewriting everything from the menus to the guest lists. He refused to admit defeat. "They'll come back," he told everyone who doubted him. "They always come back for a winner." His voice carried the same mix of confidence and desperation that had always defined him. He wasn't trying to convince the others anymore. He was trying to convince himself. Virginia Hill watched him unravel. Their relationship had once been built on passion, but now it was sustained only by tension and lies. She had grown tired of his outbursts, his paranoia, his endless obsession with the casino. At times he accused her of betrayal, of hiding money that belonged to him, of talking to the men back east. Sometimes she denied it, sometimes she didn't bother. They shouted until their voices broke, then fell silent, and the kind of quiet that only comes from love turned into hatred. The Flamingo had become the third presence in their relationship, a jealous monster consuming everything around it. Meyer Lansky, still loyal to his old friend, tried to help from afar. He sent word through intermediaries, urging the mob to hold off on any drastic action. He argued that Siegel needed time, that no empire was built overnight, that the Flamingo could still turn into a gold mine. But Meyer was fighting a losing battle. The other bosses had lost patience. They saw the numbers, and the numbers told a story of betrayal. The books didn't balance. Millions of dollars had vanished. Every audit, every inquiry led to confusion and contradiction. Some said Siegel had hidden the money in Swiss banks. Others claimed Virginia had smuggled it out of the country. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Siegel had always treated money like water, something that flowed through his hands as easily as it came. He spent it without thought, as if his charm and power would always refill his pockets. But the men he worked for didn't see it that way. They saw a liability, a man who had grown too big for his own good. The Flamingo shut its doors just weeks after opening. It was an admission of failure, a pause in the dream that felt like death itself to Siegel. He left Las Vegas for Los Angeles, but his mind never left the desert. He told anyone who would listen that it wasn't over, that the resort would reopen, that the next time would be different. He wasn't wrong. When the Flamingo finally reopened a few months later, it began to make money, lots of it. But by then the decision had already been made. The mob's judgment was final, and no amount of profit could undo it. Bugsy had enemies everywhere now. The police wanted him for old charges. The mob wanted him dead. The Hollywood crowd, once eager to bask in his glow, now avoided him. He had become toxic, radioactive, a man whose fall was too loud to ignore. And yet he still carried himself like a king. Even as the walls closed in, he refused to bow his head. His days became filled with paranoia. He felt eyes on him wherever he went. He changed cars often, avoided the same routes, kept a gun under his pillow. He didn't trust anyone, not even Virginia. Their fights had turned violent. He accused her of betrayal more than once, sometimes even threatening her life. She'd laugh in his face, calling him a fool, telling him he was finished. But beneath her words there was fear. She could feel the end coming too. Back east, the bosses met in quiet rooms, their decisions hidden behind clouds of cigar smoke. Bugsy Siegel's name came up again and again, always followed by the same conclusion. He had cost them millions. He had defied orders. He had become uncontrollable. It was time to end it. Meyer Lansky, torn between loyalty and reason, stayed silent. He knew that speaking too loudly in Bugsy's defense could make him a target too. Still, when the final word came down, he felt the weight of it like a blade pressed to his heart. June 1947 arrived hot and dry. Los Angeles shimmered under the summer sun, pretending not to notice the dark currents moving beneath its calm surface. Bugsy spent his days pacing, restless and agitated. He still talked about new plans, new deals, as if he could outrun the inevitable. At night, he often stayed at Virginia's house, a lavish Beverly Hills home filled with expensive furniture and silent tension. She had left for Europe, supposedly to escape the chaos. But some said she knew what was coming and wanted no part of it. On the evening of June 20th, Siegel sat in the living room, reading the Los Angeles Times. The room was quiet except for the hum of the radio and the sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the background. He looked calm, almost serene, as if he believed he had survived the storm. Then, without warning, 9 bullets tore through the window. 2 hit him, 1 in the head, 1 in the chest. He died instantly, the paper still in his hands. The glass shattered, the room filled with smoke, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the man who had dreamed of building a city from sand, was gone. The news spread like wildfire. The Hollywood elite whispered behind closed doors, pretending to be shocked but secretly relieved. The underworld nodded in silent approval. The message was clear: no one was untouchable. Within minutes of his death, men in Las Vegas walked into the Flamingo and took control. No resistance, no confusion. The empire moved on without him. Virginia Hill, when she heard the news, supposedly fainted. Others said she didn't even blink, that she had known it was coming all along. The police questioned her, of course, but she claimed innocence. "He had enemies everywhere," she said, her voice cold. "You'll never know who did it." And she was right. No one was ever charged with the murder. Some said it was ordered by the commission. Others whispered it was personal, a debt unpaid, a betrayal avenged. But in truth, it didn't matter. In the world Siegel lived in, the cause was always the same: money and power. Meyer Lansky mourned quietly. He didn't attend any funerals or make public statements. He simply withdrew, burying his grief beneath the cold logic that had always guided him. He knew Bugsy had brought it on himself, but that didn't make it easier. They had built an empire together, survived wars and betrayals, and dreamed of things no one else dared imagine. But in the end, even friendship had limits in their world. The Flamingo, once Siegel's obsession, thrived after his death. It became the cornerstone of Las Vegas, the first jewel in what would become a city of lights and sin. New hotels followed, new casinos, new fortunes. The desert that had swallowed Bugsy Siegel's body gave birth to his dream. In death, he had built something greater than he ever could in life. Every glowing sign, every ringing slot machine, every neon reflection in the Las Vegas night carried his ghost. People couldn't forget him. Reporters turned his life into legend. Books were written, movies made, each one painting him in a different light, some as a visionary, others as a monster. But the truth was both simpler and darker. He was a man consumed by his own ambition, someone who believed he could control everything, even fate. He was fearless, yes, but fearlessness without restraint is just another kind of madness. In the end, Bugsy Siegel got exactly what he had always chased: a legacy. Not the kind carved in stone, but one etched in light, in the endless glow of a city that would never sleep. His story became part of the mythology of Las Vegas, a reminder that every dream in the desert comes at a price. The city he imagined grew beyond his wildest expectations. The casinos multiplied, the crowds poured in, and fortunes changed hands in the blink of an eye. Every gambler who won or lost at a table under the neon sky owed a silent debt to the man who first saw what the desert could become. Even decades later, his name lingered in the air, whispered in the smoky corners of casinos, a ghost among the gamblers. But for those who knew the truth, the memory carried a warning. The same fire that drove Bugsy Siegel to greatness also burned him alive. He lived fast, dreamed big, and died young, leaving behind a world forever changed by his ambition. He proved that one man could build a kingdom from dust, but he also proved that the price of power is always blood. For Meyer Lansky, for Virginia Hill, and for all who walked in his shadow, life went on. The syndicate continued to grow, richer and more powerful than ever. The men who ordered his death likely toasted to their success, never realizing that the city they now controlled was built not just from money, but from the madness and vision of the man they killed. Years later, as Las Vegas transformed from a desert oasis into a world capital of excess, historians would look back and argue over Siegel's place in its creation. Some called him a visionary entrepreneur, others dismissed him as a reckless gangster. But everyone agreed on one thing: without him, Las Vegas might never have existed. In the photographs that remain, Bugsy Siegel looks untouchable, his eyes bright, his smile sharp, his suit immaculate. It's the face of a man who believed he could outrun destiny. But in that confidence lies the tragedy of his life. He didn't understand that the same people who made him powerful would one day decide his end. He lived by their rules, and when he broke them, he paid the price. In the end, the story of Bugsy Siegel is the story of America's dark side. The hunger for more, the illusion of control, the dream that turns into a nightmare. He was the embodiment of ambition without limits, of beauty laced with danger. And even now, as the lights of Las Vegas burn brighter every night, somewhere in that endless desert, his ghost still lingers, watching the city he built rise higher and shine harder, a monument to both his genius and his downfall. Years passed, but the shadow of Bugsy Siegel never truly faded. His death had been a violent punctuation mark at the end of one chapter of organized crime, but it also signaled the beginning of something larger, an era where the mob's empire expanded beyond the back alleys and speakeasies, reaching into boardrooms, hotels, and cities built on illusion. Las Vegas had become a symbol of everything Siegel had dreamed of: wealth, power, and escape. Yet to those who had known him, the city's success was haunted by the echo of his fall. In the years following Siegel's death, Meyer Lansky became the quiet architect of the new order. Where Bugsy had relied on charm and spectacle, Lansky relied on numbers and patience. He understood that survival depended not on making noise, but on blending into the system. He was meticulous, cold, and unflinchingly pragmatic. To him, Las Vegas wasn't a dream. It was a business model, one that could be replicated across borders. He invested through intermediaries, never showing his hand. Hotels rose in the desert, financed by money that flowed like a river from Cuba, Miami, and New York. Each new casino bore the marks of the syndicate's invisible fingerprints. The Flamingo, once Siegel's doomed monument, became a template. Its success proved that the mob could operate in daylight, that crime could wear a tuxedo and shake hands with senators. It was no longer about hiding. It was about owning everything. But while Lansky grew wealthier, he also grew lonelier. The deaths of his old friends, Luciano's exile, Siegel's murder, and the disappearance of others, had hollowed him out. He had survived by being cautious, but that caution came at a cost. He often thought of Siegel, not with anger, but with a kind of melancholy admiration. Bugsy had been reckless, yes, but there was something pure in his recklessness, a belief that he could turn violence into beauty, crime into art. Meyer had built an empire, but Bugsy had built a legend. Virginia Hill, meanwhile, drifted through Europe like a ghost. After Siegel's death, she became the subject of endless speculation. Some said she had been involved in his murder, others that she had fled with his hidden fortune. The truth was less glamorous. The underworld had no patience for widows of the fallen. Without Siegel's protection, she was just another liability. The money she had saved vanished quickly in the casinos and nightclubs of Rome and Paris. Her once golden life faded into scandal, and the woman who had been called the Queen of the Mob became just another forgotten story whispered in dark bars. In her later years, Virginia spoke little of Bugsy. When she did, her tone carried both love and bitterness. She described him as brilliant, impossible, and doomed. "He wanted too much," she said once, staring into a glass of wine. "And the world doesn't forgive men who want everything." Her death, many years later, would be ruled a suicide, but those who knew her suspected otherwise. Like Siegel, she had lived too close to the flame. Back in Las Vegas, the syndicate's grip tightened. The city became a machine built to print money. The desert transformed into a kingdom of vice where fortunes changed hands every night. Behind the shimmering lights, the mob laundered billions through casinos that appeared legitimate on paper but were run by silent partners from Chicago, New York, and Miami. Politicians looked the other way, bought and paid for with cash and favors. Reporters who asked too many questions disappeared, but success bred ambition, and ambition bred greed. The same forces that had destroyed Siegel began to surface again. Different faces, same hunger. The men who followed him were no less ruthless, but they lacked his vision. They built higher towers, flashier hotels, bigger dreams, but none carried the same dangerous beauty. Siegel's dream had been personal, born from a strange mix of art and arrogance. Theirs was purely transactional. By the mid-1950s, Las Vegas had become the capital of American temptation. Celebrities performed for mob bosses, politicians gambled beside hitmen, and the desert sparkled with the illusion of freedom. But underneath it all was the same blood-soaked foundation. The syndicate's money touched everything, from construction companies to banks to movie studios. The American dream itself had been corrupted, turned into a game of chance. FBI agents began to take notice. The Bureau had ignored organized crime for decades, dismissing it as local thuggery, but the sheer scale of the syndicate's empire could no longer be denied. Men like J. Edgar Hoover may have pretended the mafia didn't exist, but younger agents saw the pattern. They saw the hidden hands moving behind casinos, labor unions, and even political campaigns. Bugsy Siegel's vision had changed more than Las Vegas. It had exposed a truth about America itself, that crime and success were sometimes the same thing. As years passed, stories about Siegel became legend. Some said he was buried with diamonds in his pockets. Others claimed his ghost still walked the halls of the Flamingo at night, searching for the fortune that had vanished. Tourists began to whisper his name as they passed the casino's pink walls, not realizing how much of what surrounded them had been built from his madness. For those who had known him, memory was more complicated. To Meyer Lansky, Bugsy represented both a triumph and a tragedy. Without him, Las Vegas might never have existed, but his recklessness had almost destroyed them all. Lansky often said in private that Siegel's greatest crime wasn't stealing, it was dreaming too loudly. By the 1960s, the world that Bugsy had helped build was beginning to change. The mob's influence was being challenged by corporate money. Legitimate investors began buying into Las Vegas, cleaning up its image, turning vice into tourism. The desert city was no longer a gangster's playground. It was America's playground. The old guard watched in silence as their empire slipped away, one legal deal at a time. Still, even as businessmen replaced mobsters, the spirit of Siegel remained. The architecture, the glamour, the illusion of danger, it was all his. The Flamingo's neon lights still burned every night, casting a pink glow across the strip, as if the city itself refused to let go of the man who had given it life. There was one story, told by an old bellhop who had worked at the Flamingo since the early days. He claimed that on quiet nights you could still hear footsteps echoing through the halls long after everyone had gone home. He said they were Bugsy's, restless, impatient, never satisfied. Others laughed it off, but the old man swore it was true. He built this place with his blood, he said. He ain't leaving it for nobody. By the time Lansky grew old, he had seen his empire shrink. The government pursued him relentlessly, freezing accounts, seizing assets, dragging him through courts. He died without the fortune everyone believed he had hidden, insisting to the end that he was just a businessman. But those who understood history knew better. He was the survivor, the tactician, the man who had turned the chaos of Siegel's dream into something enduring. And yet even he couldn't escape the shadow of the man who had died staring at a newspaper under a broken window. History has a strange way of deciding who becomes immortal. Bugsy Siegel was, by all rational accounts, a criminal, a murderer, a thief, a man who built his fortune on blood. But time softens the edges. The violence fades, and what remains is the legend. Today, his name is spoken not with fear, but with fascination. He has become the romantic outlaw, the visionary gangster who saw beauty in sin. In the quiet hours of the Las Vegas night, when the slot machines hum and the neon buzzes like electricity in the veins of the city, it's easy to imagine him there, standing on the edge of the strip, cigarette in hand, watching the skyline glow. Maybe he smiles, seeing what it's become. Maybe he laughs at the irony that the world he died for is now celebrated as the pinnacle of entertainment. Or maybe, like all ghosts, he simply watches in silence, knowing that the dream he built from sand will outlive everyone who buried him. There's a strange poetry in the fact that Bugsy Siegel's legacy, born in violence and betrayal, became one of light and allure. His death may have silenced him, but his vision roared on, louder than ever. Every casino that rises, every deal that's made in the neon glare, carries a trace of him. The dreamer, the gambler, the man who believed he could tame the desert. He once said, "Las Vegas will be the future." He was right, decades later. The Flamingo still stands, rebuilt, repainted, reinvented, but alive. And somewhere, beneath all the layers of time, the foundation remains the same. Beneath the marble floors and LED screens lies the ghost of a man who saw possibility where others saw emptiness. A man who turned sand into gold. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel didn't live to see his dream fulfilled, but in death, he achieved something even greater. He became eternal. His story became a reminder that visionaries often die before the world is ready for them. And though the mob moved on, though the names changed and the faces faded, Las Vegas remained his creation, a monument built by crime, sustained by illusion and blessed by madness. In the end, the city became everything he had promised and more. And somewhere out there, beyond the glittering horizon, under the vast Nevada night sky, the ghost of Bugsy Siegel still walks, forever chasing the light of a dream he could never quite hold. Time had moved on, but the legend of Bugsy Siegel continued to pulse through the veins of Las Vegas like a secret the city could never fully bury. By the 1970s, the Strip had become a surreal monument to excess, a cathedral of neon, gambling, and greed. Tourists came by the millions, chasing the same dream Siegel once saw shimmering in the desert heat. They didn't know his name, not really. To them, Las Vegas had always been there, eternal and self-made. But beneath the bright lights, old men still whispered about the gangster who started it all. The mob's presence in Vegas during that era was both invisible and absolute. Every casino had a silent partner somewhere, men in tailored suits from Chicago, New York, or Kansas City, who collected envelopes stuffed with unrecorded cash. They called it the skim. A percentage of every dollar that crossed the tables disappeared before it reached the books. It was Bugsy's original idea to create an empire that bled money invisibly, and it worked for decades. But what he could not have foreseen was how greed, that same intoxicating force that drove him, would one day become the mob's undoing. Back east, the old commission was splintering. The balance that Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel had once crafted through loyalty and order was dissolving under the weight of ego and mistrust. Younger bosses, hungry for power, cared little for the codes of the past. They saw Las Vegas not as a dream to protect, but as a resource to exploit. They squeezed harder, took more, drew attention. The FBI, armed with new surveillance technology and political will, began to dig into the casinos. Wiretaps, informants, hidden cameras, all tools Siegel's generation had never imagined, exposed the rot beneath the glitter. Agents sat in unmarked vans, listening to the voices of men who thought themselves untouchable. Conversations about hidden ledgers, unreported profits, and buried bodies began to surface in courtrooms. One by one, the syndicates that had ruled the Strip were dismantled, not by gunfire, but by subpoenas. And yet, through it all, Bugsy's ghost lingered. The very thing he had dreamed of, Las Vegas as a legitimate empire, was being realized, just not in the way he had imagined. Corporations began buying out mob interests. Multi-million-dollar deals replaced the handshake agreements of the underworld. The suits that walked into the casinos now carried briefcases instead of guns. But they were no less ruthless. They played the same game, just with lawyers instead of enforcers. Old-timers in the city spoke of a strange justice in that. Bugsy had died for wanting to bring class to crime. Now crime had become class itself. His vision had been fulfilled, but stripped of soul. Where once the desert had whispered promises to outlaws, it now screamed with advertisements. Neon towers replaced the small, intimate casinos of the past. The Flamingo, once his crown jewel, was remodeled so many times it barely resembled what he had built. Still, the name endured, a memorial glowing pink against the dark Nevada sky. Meyer Lansky lived long enough to see this transformation. He had survived countless investigations, deportations, and betrayals. He watched as men he once considered brothers fell to prison or bullets, while he remained the last relic of a forgotten order. There were times he would sit quietly in his small Miami apartment, flipping through old newspapers that mentioned Siegel's murder. He never spoke of it openly, but those close to him said that even in his final years, he referred to Bugsy not as a mistake, but as the spark. The kid saw things no one else did, Lansky would murmur. He was crazy, but he was right. It was the closest thing to an admission of love that the old gangster ever gave. The FBI hounded Lansky until his dying day, believing he had millions hidden offshore. They never found it. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it never existed. Or maybe, like Siegel's missing money, it was hidden in the sand, buried beneath the foundations of a city built on lies. By the time the 1980s rolled in, Las Vegas was fully corporate. The mob's influence had faded into folklore. Yet, even as businessmen took over, the city retained that seductive sense of danger, the feeling that something darker pulsed beneath the glamour. It was a legacy Bugsy had branded into the soul of the desert. Vegas was not merely a city of lights. It was a monument to vice disguised as success. Every dreamer who came to Las Vegas chasing fortune was, in a way, following Bugsy's footsteps. They gambled against impossible odds, believing they could beat the house, just as he had believed he could beat fate. Some won, most lost, but all of them were participating in the same illusion. That was the genius of Siegel's idea, not the casino itself, but the psychology of hope. He had understood something fundamental about human nature. People would always risk everything for the chance at something greater. Whether it was a roll of the dice or a dream in the desert, that hunger never died. And Las Vegas became the ultimate altar for that belief. Historians and journalists later debated Bugsy's role in the city's creation. Some credited him as the father of modern Las Vegas. Others dismissed him as a reckless criminal whose contributions were overstated. But those who had been there, builders, gamblers, and hustlers, knew the truth. Without Bugsy, there might never have been a reason to believe in the desert. His story became mythic, retold in books and movies, each version twisting the truth a little more. He was portrayed as everything from a romantic anti-hero to a cold-blooded killer. The reality, as always, was more complicated. Bugsy Siegel was both, the visionary and the villain. His brilliance was inseparable from his brutality. He built his empire not despite his flaws, but because of them. There were nights, long after the Strip had gone to sleep, when the wind would whip through the desert with a low, hollow moan. Locals said it sounded like laughter, his laughter. The same manic magnetic sound that had once echoed through Hollywood parties and backroom meetings. They said it was the desert remembering its first true believer. In some way, Bugsy's fate had always been written in that sand. Men like him were never meant to grow old. They burned too bright, too fast. His story was America's story in miniature. Ambition, success, betrayal, and the inevitable fall. He wanted to build something eternal, and in doing so he ensured his own destruction. But unlike the countless gangsters who came and went, Bugsy had built something tangible, something the world could still see. His empire didn't vanish with his death. It expanded. In death, he achieved what he could never manage in life: permanence. Years later, when tourists snapped photos outside the Flamingo, they did so under lights that had first burned for him. Every shimmer of pink neon was a reflection of his madness. He had turned crime into an art form, and even though history tried to clean it up, the stains remained. Some stories claim that when the Flamingo was renovated in the late 20th century, workers unearthed a small box buried beneath one of the old walls. Inside, there were a few photographs: Bugsy in a tuxedo beside Virginia Hill, smiling at some forgotten party, and a small tarnished key. No one ever figured out what the key opened. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was everything. But it became a symbol of his mystery, a reminder that even in the most exposed city on Earth, some secrets stay buried. Virginia Hill's name faded from the headlines, but her legend followed her into the afterlife. The tabloids had called her the mob queen, but those who had seen her and Bugsy together said she was more than that. She was his mirror, beautiful, dangerous, uncontainable. In her, Bugsy had found both comfort and chaos. Their love had been as doomed as his dream, and when she was gone, it was as though the last piece of his humanity vanished with her. Decades later, their story would inspire songs, films, and endless speculation. But the truth of their bond remained locked between them, sealed by time and tragedy. As the city evolved, so did its meaning. The mob's fingerprints faded, replaced by corporate polish and digital screens, but the essence remained the same. Las Vegas was still about illusion, the promise of fortune, the seduction of control, the beauty of losing everything in pursuit of something more. It was Bugsy's philosophy, written in lights instead of blood. Every generation has its outlaws, its dreamers who defy the odds. But few have left behind something so enduring, so paradoxical. Bugsy Siegel was a man who saw the future through the lens of crime, who used violence to create beauty, who dreamed of legitimacy in a world built on sin. And though history has tried to define him, the truth remains elusive. He was not good or evil. He was both, human in the most dangerous way possible. Today, as planes descend into McCarran Airport and visitors catch their first glimpse of the glowing Strip, they are unknowingly looking at Bugsy's masterpiece. Every light, every sound, every glimmering promise traces back to one man's madness and ambition. He may have died alone, betrayed and broken, but in the end, he won. His dream outlived everyone who doubted him, and so, the desert remains alive with his ghost, not haunting, but watching, proud of what it became. Because in a way, Las Vegas didn't just survive him, it became him. By the late 20th century, Las Vegas had become a paradox wrapped in neon. It was a city built on fantasy and deceit, a glittering mirage of wealth that seemed to stretch endlessly under the desert sun. The mob had mostly disappeared by then, at least on paper. Corporations now ran the casinos, politicians smiled for photo ops, and the press spoke of economic development rather than organized crime. But in truth, the ghosts never left. The shadows of those first dreamers, the gangsters who carved this empire out of sand and blood, still lingered in the back rooms, in the quiet exchanges of power, and in the way the city pulsed restlessly, as if feeding on its own history. And at the center of that ghostly lineage remained Bugsy Siegel, the man who had dared to see light in darkness. For many of the old-timers who had known him or worked for him, Bugsy was still more myth than man. Some remembered him as charming and magnetic, others as volatile and cruel. They spoke of his icy blue eyes that could switch from charm to murder in an instant, of his relentless pursuit of perfection, and of his strange obsession with beauty, something few gangsters had ever cared about. Bugsy had believed in aesthetics even in crime. Where others saw vice as dirty business, he saw it as a performance. He dressed like a movie star, spoke like a poet, and killed like a professional. To him, crime wasn't just a means to power. It was a stage upon which he could play out his own mythology. The men who came after him never understood that. The corporate tycoons who built their hotel towers in the 1980s and 1990s might have had more money, but they lacked the imagination that had driven Bugsy to build a city where none should have existed. He hadn't just wanted to make a profit. He had wanted to create an experience, a world that defied the logic of morality and geography alike. When he looked out over the desert in the 1940s, he saw not sand and emptiness, but potential. That, perhaps, was his truest sin. Not murder or theft, but the audacity to dream beyond his own survival. The Flamingo, his crown jewel, had changed many times by then. The pink glow still adorned its walls, but its soul was diluted. Tourists shuffled through the casino floors without any sense of the blood that had been spilled to make them possible. Somewhere, under layers of renovations, the walls that had once echoed with Bugsy's voice remained, mute witnesses to a vision that had cost its creator his life. It was said that one of the original marble tiles from Siegel's private suite was still there, preserved beneath new flooring, as if the city itself refused to erase him completely. Writers and filmmakers resurrected his story again and again, each time reimagining him through a different lens. Some painted him as a romantic outlaw, others as a psychopath. But every version circled the same truth. Bugsy Siegel was the man who bridged the worlds of crime and culture. He was the moment the mob stepped out of the alleys and into the limelight. Before him, gangsters hid in shadows. After him, they wore silk ties and shook hands with producers and politicians. He was, in every sense, the first modern criminal celebrity. The irony, of course, was that Bugsy had always despised being called Bugsy. It was a nickname that mocked his temper, his unpredictability, his madness. He preferred Benjamin, elegant, serious, respectable. It was as if he believed he could will himself into legitimacy simply by denying his own myth. But the world had already made up its mind. To them, he would forever be Bugsy, the beautiful lunatic who had tried to turn sin into a luxury brand. As the city grew, those who knew its origins often wondered what Siegel would have thought of it all. Would he have marveled at the spectacle or scoffed at how commercial it had become? The Strip had grown monstrous, swallowing up its own history. The mob had been replaced by mega-corporations, the smoky backrooms replaced by boardrooms, but the heart of it remained the same. The dealers still smiled through exhaustion, the gamblers still prayed for luck, and the city still devoured souls one dream at a time. Las Vegas was still a machine built to seduce and consume, just as Siegel had intended. Yet for all its splendor, something of the old darkness still pulsed beneath the surface. It was in the way money vanished without explanation, in the mysterious deaths that occasionally made headlines, in the quiet favors exchanged between casino executives and politicians. The methods had changed, but the spirit of corruption remained timeless. Siegel would have understood that. He had always believed that morality was a luxury for those who could afford it. The rest had to make do with survival. Every generation of Vegas insiders carried his legacy like an unspoken curse. The city's culture of risk and reward, of illusion and ambition, was pure Siegel. Every bright light on the Strip cast a shadow, and in that shadow lived the same hunger that had once driven him to risk everything. His fingerprints were everywhere, on the city's architecture, its attitude, its relentless push toward excess. Las Vegas was, at its core, a reflection of Bugsy himself, dazzling, dangerous, and destined to burn. There's a story told among old casino workers that in the early days, before the Flamingo's renovations, strange things used to happen in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Dealers reported seeing a figure in a suit walking the floor, eyes cold and watchful. Security guards swore they'd hear the faint echo of footsteps near the old penthouse, even when it was locked. One cocktail waitress, years later, told a journalist she once felt someone brush past her and whisper, "Keep it beautiful." She turned, but no one was there. The air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and cologne. Maybe it was just the imagination of a city built on illusion. Or maybe some dreams, especially those born of obsession, refused to die. Meanwhile, across the country, crime historians began piecing together Siegel's story in a new light. They dug through court transcripts, FBI files, and eyewitness accounts, discovering that much of what people believed about him was half-truth or fabrication. He hadn't been as rich as the movies suggested. He hadn't built Las Vegas alone. He hadn't even wanted to run the Flamingo at first. But what those facts failed to capture was the essence of his myth, the way his ambition had transformed the criminal world from a backstreet business into an empire of spectacle. Without Siegel, there might have been no golden age of Vegas, no Rat Pack era, no mystique surrounding the city as a playground for sin. He had been the blueprint. Sinatra, Elvis, the showgirls, the gambling culture, all of it had sprouted from the seed he planted. The Flamingo had been his gamble, but America itself had become his table. Some say the mob never forgave itself for killing him. Meyer Lansky, in his final interviews, deflected every question about Siegel's death, but his silence was louder than any confession. Those who knew him believed Lansky carried that guilt to the grave. Bugsy's death had been an execution, but it had also been a warning to dreamers, to rebels, to anyone who dared to put art before obedience. It taught the syndicate that visionaries were liabilities, and yet history proved that Siegel had been right all along. By the turn of the century, Las Vegas had grown into a global phenomenon, a city of spectacle so immense that it defied morality altogether. It was a living paradox, a place built on sin that pretended to celebrate freedom. The same kind of freedom Bugsy had craved. But unlike him, Vegas had survived by never standing still. It kept reinventing itself, just as Siegel had tried to do. Perhaps that's why his spirit still lingers, because the city itself is his reincarnation. His name may not be on the signs, but every light, every laugh, every spin of the roulette wheel carries the rhythm of his madness. He had built more than a casino. He had built an idea, and like all great ideas born from chaos, it outlived the man who conceived it. Even now, when historians speak of Las Vegas's creation, they use his name as the starting point. Benjamin Siegel, the gangster who built paradise from dust, the man who believed the American dream could be bought, sold, and played like a game of chance. In a way, he had been right. Because in Las Vegas, everyone becomes a gambler, and whether they win or lose, they're all living out the fantasy Bugsy first imagined, a world where luck and destiny blur until no one can tell the difference. And so, every time another hotel opens, every time another fortune is won and lost in the desert night, the legend grows. Somewhere in the flicker of those endless lights, the ghost of Bugsy Siegel still smiles, satisfied that the world finally caught up to his madness. Decades passed, and yet the story of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel refused to fade. It drifted between truth and legend, reshaped with every retelling, whispered in smoky bars by men who once brushed shoulders with history and now lived quietly in its shadow. But behind the glamour, the myth, and the ghostly aura that clung to his name, there was still something profoundly human about him, a hunger not just for power but for meaning. That hunger had driven him from the grimy streets of Brooklyn to the blinding deserts of Nevada, and long after his death, it continued to echo through every soul who dared to chase beauty through chaos. In the early years after Siegel's murder, Los Angeles became a city of silence. The Hollywood elite who had once courted him suddenly pretended not to know him. Virginia Hill vanished overseas, her laughter replaced by bitterness and exile. Meyer Lansky and the old gang retreated into business. their dreams replaced by pragmatism. They built empires, yes, but they no longer built visions. The loss of Siegel wasn't just the death of a man, it was the end of an era when criminals still believed they could be artists. But in the quiet of those years, the desert kept changing. The Flamingo rose again under new management, repaired and renamed, its books finally balanced. What had once been mocked as Bugsy's folly began turning a profit. Tourists came in droves, lured by the promise of glamour and the scent of risk. The city that Siegel had envisioned began to bloom, though it no longer belonged to him. His name was whispered only in hushed tones, as if invoking a curse. But the truth was clear to anyone who looked closely enough. The Flamingo was his ghost wearing another man's suit. Virginia Hill returned to the States briefly in the 1950s, a shadow of her former self. The newspapers called her the Queen of the Mob, but the sparkle in her eyes had long since dimmed. She spoke little of Bugsy, though in rare interviews she'd admit he had been the only man who made life feel like a movie. Her wealth was gone, her friends scattered, her youth fading. When she died years later under mysterious circumstances in Austria, the police called it suicide. But those who had known her whispered that she had never stopped hearing his voice in her dreams. "Keep it beautiful," he had told her once. And she had tried until there was nothing left to make beautiful. Meanwhile, the next generation of gangsters rose to power, colder, more efficient, less romantic. They were businessmen with guns, accountants of sin. They didn't believe in dreams. They believed in margins. To them, Siegel was a cautionary tale, a reminder that sentiment was weakness. But even they couldn't escape his influence. Every casino they touched, every deal they made, bore the architecture of his vision. He had written the blueprint for the empire they inherited. By the 1960s, Las Vegas had become an organism of its own. The Rat Pack ruled its nights, entertainers and criminals shared drinks at the same tables, and the air buzzed with a kind of electric temptation. Sinatra sang, the lights burned brighter, and fortunes shifted with every spin of the wheel. But beneath the champagne and sequins, the foundation remained haunted. The city was thriving on borrowed soul, the same restless energy Bugsy had unleashed when he first imagined paradise in the desert. If one listened closely enough on certain nights, when the crowds thinned and the desert wind carried the echoes of forgotten music, it was easy to believe he was still there, walking the strip he'd once dreamed into existence. The smell of tobacco, the faint glint of a tailored cufflink, the sudden chill in a crowded room, these became part of the city's folklore. Dealers whispered that he was still watching, that his ghost appeared whenever someone got too greedy, too daring, too much like him. It was said that if you won too big at the Flamingo, you could feel his eyes on you, judging whether you deserved it. The truth, though, was simpler and sadder. Siegel's life had been built on contradictions. He was both dreamer and destroyer, a man of taste and terror. He could charm a Hollywood starlet at dinner and shoot a rival before dessert. He wanted beauty in a world that rewarded brutality, and in trying to reconcile the two, he tore himself apart. That conflict became the essence of Las Vegas itself, a city of shimmering contradictions, where the sacred and profane danced endlessly together. Historians have long debated what might have happened if Siegel had lived. Would he have continued to build? Would he have become legitimate, perhaps even one of America's great businessmen? Or would his temper and recklessness have destroyed him sooner or later anyway? The truth is unknowable, but one thing is certain. No one else could have built Las Vegas the way he did. Others might have seen profit in the desert, but only Siegel saw destiny. His murder, as brutal as it was, didn't end his story. It immortalized him. In death, Bugsy became the perfect American myth, a man who dreamed too big, loved too recklessly, and died too young. He embodied both the promise and the peril of ambition. To the mob, he became a symbol of the dangers of ego. To Hollywood, he became a tragic hero. To the city he built, he became its eternal patron saint, a sinner who gave birth to salvation through vice. Years later, a journalist visited the old Siegel mansion in Beverly Hills. The house was long abandoned, its gardens overgrown, its windows boarded up, yet inside, the air still smelled faintly of perfume and gunpowder. In the main hallway where Bugsy had been shot, there was a faint stain on the floor, long scrubbed, but never fully gone. The journalist wrote that he felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for its master to return. He never did, of course. But in a way, he never left. The legends surrounding him grew like vines around the truth, until no one could separate one from the other. There were rumors of missing money, hidden caches of diamonds, secret lovers who carried his child. Some claimed Virginia had buried a letter from him under a desert rock somewhere near Hoover Dam, a confession or a farewell. None of it was ever proven, but people kept searching, drawn by the same hunger that had consumed him, the hunger for more. By the time Las Vegas became the entertainment capital of the world, the mob had long since been pushed out. Corporate executives replaced mob bosses and accountants replaced hitmen, but in their boardrooms and strategy meetings, they quoted Bugsy without realizing it. "Give them a show," he had once said. "People don't come for the money. They come to feel alive." That philosophy became the heartbeat of the Strip. Every neon light, every spinning wheel, every performance on every stage was a reflection of his madness, a tribute to the man who had once dared to make sin beautiful. The city evolved, but its soul remained the same. It became a living organism that thrived on hope and desperation. People still came from across the world to gamble not just with money, but with fate itself. And each of them, knowingly or not, walked in Bugsy's footsteps. They chased the same illusion he had died for, the belief that just one more bet, one more deal, one more dream could change everything. Time softened his reputation. In the public imagination, Bugsy became less a criminal and more an icon. His story was retold in films, novels, and documentaries, each adding its own layer of mythology. The movie Bugsy with Warren Beatty reignited his legend, painting him as a flawed visionary rather than a thug. New generations discovered him, not through court records or police reports, but through cinema, the same world he had longed to conquer in life. He had wanted to be remembered as someone larger than crime, and in the end, he was. His descendants, scattered and private, rarely spoke of him, though some quietly visited his grave. It was a modest tombstone for a man who had once dreamed in neon. Visitors often left casino chips on his grave, some from the Flamingo, others from rival casinos, as offerings to the ghost of ambition. No one knew why, but it felt right, as if luck itself owed him something. In the broader sense, Bugsy Siegel became a mirror for America. His life was a reflection of the country's most dangerous promise, that anyone could build their own paradise, if only they were willing to break the rules. His story was the dark side of the American dream, the proof that ambition without restraint could be both creation and destruction. And perhaps that's why, even now, his name still carries weight. Because deep down, everyone who comes to Las Vegas understands something that Bugsy knew instinctively, that beauty and ruin are two sides of the same coin, and to flip it is to live. On certain nights, when the desert wind sweeps across the Strip and the air hums with the sound of machines and laughter, you can almost hear it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Keep it beautiful. And so the city does. In the years after Bugsy Siegel's death, the world around him continued to evolve, though his presence seemed to linger like smoke from a long burned-out fire. Las Vegas, the city that had been his obsession, grew faster than anyone could have imagined. The desert he had once walked across in polished shoes and tailored suits became unrecognizable. Neon lights replaced the silence, and the once barren land was alive with music, laughter, and deceit. The mob's influence spread quietly through the veins of the city, their money hidden in walls and books, their men dressed in suits instead of shadows. But though their fingerprints were everywhere, the soul of the city belonged to one man, the dreamer who never got to see it thrive. For the men who had known him best, there was no escaping his ghost. Meyer Lansky, ever the strategist, grew older and wealthier, but he never again allowed himself to gamble on another man's dream. He had loved Bugsy like a brother, admired his courage, even envied his vision, but he also knew that vision without discipline was a curse. The night he received the phone call confirming Siegel's death, Lansky didn't say a word. He simply hung up the phone, closed his office door, and poured himself a glass of whiskey. Some said he sat there for hours, staring at the wall, seeing not the empire they'd built, but the face of the boy from Brooklyn who used to laugh at death as if it were a game. In the years that followed, Lansky often visited Las Vegas, discreet and silent, watching the Strip come alive. He never spoke Bugsy's name in public again, but sometimes, under his breath, he would whisper a line only the two of them had shared back in their youth. "We were kings once. Benny, kings." As the casinos multiplied, the money multiplied with them. The mob saw the brilliance of Siegel's idea and capitalized on it in ways he never could have imagined. They funneled millions through the desert city, using its lights as camouflage for their crimes. Chicago, New York, Cleveland, all the major syndicates had their fingers in the pot now. The dream that had been born out of one man's imagination had become an industry, a machine that consumed everyone who tried to control it. The men who had mocked Bugsy for his recklessness now made fortunes off the very foundation he had built. But there was no joy in it, no glory. They built a city of profit, not passion, and though they ruled it, none of them truly owned it. Virginia Hill's absence was another ghost that haunted those years. Though she fled Europe, her name never disappeared from the papers. The authorities investigated her for money laundering, tax evasion, and her connection to Siegel's death, but she slipped through their fingers every time. Some claimed she was still handling mob money overseas, moving it through banks and casinos in Switzerland. Others believed she had lost everything and lived quietly in exile, nursing her regrets. What was certain was that she had loved Bugsy in her own strange way, not with loyalty, but with fire. And fire, once lit, does not easily fade. Those who had seen them together always said they were two alike, beautiful, dangerous, and doomed. By the late 1950s, the Flamingo had become one of the most successful casinos in the world. New investors had turned it into the shining jewel of the Strip. Crowds flocked to it, drawn by the promise of glamour and danger that still hung in the air like perfume. It was as if the walls themselves remembered his laughter, his rage, his relentless pursuit of perfection. Bartenders swore that sometimes, late at night, glasses would fall from shelves without reason. Dealers spoke of lights flickering at empty tables. One security guard quit after claiming he saw a man in a white suit walking the hallway near the suite where Siegel had once stayed. When he followed, the hallway was empty, but the faint scent of cologne lingered in the air. Whether these were ghost stories or guilty consciences hardly mattered. What mattered was that Bugsy Siegel had become more than a man. He was a myth. He represented something the city itself understood, that glory is only born through madness. His story became a warning and a romance all at once. The newspapers occasionally revived his name when writing about the mob, describing him as the visionary criminal who built the impossible. They didn't know how right they were. Outside the world of crime, America was changing. The war was over, and prosperity filled the country. Highways stretched across the land, carrying families west toward dreams of sunshine and success. Las Vegas, with its flashing lights and open secrets, became a symbol of that dream. It was America's playground, where the rules could be broken and sins forgiven by morning. The very thing that had destroyed Bugsy had now become the country's obsession. He had been too early, too ambitious. In another time, perhaps, he would have been hailed as a pioneer instead of a criminal. In the early 1960s, a journalist named Robert Lansky decided to write a book about the origins of Las Vegas. He dug through court records, FBI files, and old photographs, piecing together the story of the man behind the myth. The deeper he went, the more fascinated he became. Every person he interviewed, from aging mobsters to casino workers, described Siegel the same way: charming, dangerous, impossible to forget. One old associate told him, "You could hate him, sure, but you'd still follow him anywhere. He made you believe you were part of something eternal." When Lansky's book was published, it reignited public fascination with Siegel. People wanted to know more about the man who had turned dust into diamonds. Hollywood producers began sniffing around, sensing a story that was too good to resist. Within a few years, Bugsy Siegel's life was turned into film scripts, stage plays, and documentaries. Each one portrayed him differently, some as a ruthless gangster, others as a misunderstood visionary. But all of them agreed on one thing: without him, there would be no Las Vegas. The mob, of course, hated the attention. They preferred their history to remain buried. To them, Siegel was not a hero, but a mistake, a man who forgot that dreams don't belong to gangsters. And yet even they couldn't deny what he had accomplished. Lansky himself, in a rare moment of candor, once told an associate, "Benny built the road. We just drove on it." As the decades rolled on, the Strip expanded. New casinos rose higher, brighter, bolder. The Rat Pack years gave way to the corporate era, where the mafia's grip began to loosen under federal pressure. The FBI launched relentless investigations, cracking open the alliances that had built the city. One by one, the old guard fell, arrested, deported, or quietly retired. By the 1980s, the mob's presence in Las Vegas had faded, replaced by corporations with legal teams instead of hitmen. But even the cleanest suits couldn't scrub away the city's origin story. Bugsy Siegel's fingerprints were still on every poker chip, every chandelier, every contract signed in gold ink. In 1991, the movie Bugsy premiered, starring Warren Beatty and Annette Bening. It was a love story disguised as a crime saga, painting Bugsy as both hero and fool, a man destroyed by his own passion. The film won awards, critics praised it, and audiences fell in love with the myth all over again. For a new generation, Siegel wasn't a murderer or a mobster. He was a dreamer who dared to build something immortal, even in death. He was winning. The Flamingo celebrated its 50th anniversary with fanfare, inviting celebrities, descendants of mobsters, and historians. They toasted the man who started it all, even if the company officially refused to use his name. That night, as fireworks burst over the strip, an old man sitting in the crowd, Meyer Lansky's nephew, was overheard saying softly, "He'd have liked this." He always wanted the sky to look expensive. Outside the glitz and glamour, in the quiet outskirts of Las Vegas, the desert remained as it always had, endless, empty, ancient. The city's glow could be seen for miles, but beyond that light lay darkness, the kind that swallowed everything. Locals said that sometimes, on windless nights, you could hear a car engine humming faintly from nowhere, headlights flashing across the dunes before vanishing. They said it was Bugsy, still driving through the desert, searching for the perfect place to build again. In truth, Las Vegas had become his monument. Every hotel tower was a gravestone. Every jackpot was a prayer. Every sin a sacrifice. And though his body lay cold in a Beverly Hills cemetery, his soul was alive in every gambler's heartbeat. Because Siegel had given them something they didn't even know they wanted. A place where dreams could die beautifully. Time marched on, but memory doesn't fade so easily. The men who killed him are all long gone, their names buried beneath years of silence. But his story remains. It lingers in the glint of a roulette wheel, the whisper of dice across velvet, the sigh of a loser walking into the night. Las Vegas never apologizes, never slows down, never looks back, just as he wanted. There is a saying among old-timers on the Strip: the desert takes everything but the dream. That's Bugsy's legacy. He gave his life to build a fantasy, and the world rewarded him with eternity. And so, as long as the lights burn in Las Vegas, Benjamin Siegel will never truly die. The years drifted on, and yet the ghost of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel seemed to grow stronger instead of fading. Time had a way of polishing criminals into legends, of sanding down their sins until all that remained was the glimmer of their dreams. For most men, death closed the book. For Siegel, it only turned the page. His story was no longer confined to crime reports or whispered gossip. It became woven into the very mythology of America. That dangerous promise that anyone could build an empire if they had the guts to defy the impossible. Las Vegas had transformed beyond recognition. By the 1970s, it was a glittering organism of vice and illusion, a city that never slept and never forgave. Casinos reached higher, brighter, bolder. Money poured in from every corner of the country. Tourists, hustlers, drifters, and dreamers all feeding the machine he had built. But even in the noise, something about the place still felt like him. The showgirls, the cigars, the velvet curtains, the way gamblers' eyes glowed under the shimmer of neon. It all carried traces of the man who once imagined beauty in the middle of desolation. And yet, while his city thrived, the people who had known him faded into the quiet corners of history. Meyer Lansky lived out his later years in relative peace, but he was never free of ghosts. He often walked the Strip during the early mornings when the air was cool and the lights dimmed, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. He would stop in front of the Flamingo, his reflection caught in the mirrored glass, and stare for long minutes before turning away. He didn't need to say it aloud. He knew whose city it truly was. Lansky, pragmatic to the end, once told an interviewer late in life, "Benny was reckless, sure, but without him, Vegas would have been a truck stop." It was the closest he ever came to confession. The mob, meanwhile, continued its quiet operations until the federal crackdowns of the late 20th century dismantled the old system. The FBI, armed with wiretaps and indictments, began cutting through the underworld one deal at a time. The old bosses were jailed or died, and the new breed that replaced them were businessmen wearing ties instead of holsters. Yet even these men, educated, corporate, sterile, could not resist invoking Siegel's legacy when talking about the foundations of the industry. They called him the visionary, the first modern gangster, the man who saw what no one else did. What had once been seen as lunacy was now praised as foresight. It was ironic, and perhaps a little cruel, that the same world that had condemned him as reckless now worshipped the ground he had dreamed on. But that was the nature of visionaries. They were never understood until it was too late. Bugsy Siegel had been a man out of step with his time, too romantic for the brutality of the underworld and too dangerous for the gentility of the business world. He didn't belong anywhere, so he built his own world. And in that world, even for a brief moment, he was king. In Beverly Hills, his mansion stood silent for decades. It changed hands several times, each new owner reporting odd happenings, lights turning on by themselves, the faint smell of cigar smoke in empty rooms, windows that refused to stay closed. Some claimed to see him near the fireplace, the same spot where he had been gunned down, his silhouette reflected in the glass. Others heard whispers, a man's voice murmuring softly in the dark, though no one could ever make out the words. Whether haunted or not, the house carried the weight of its history, and eventually it was renovated beyond recognition. But the stain of blood beneath the tiles was said to have never completely vanished, no matter how many times it was cleaned or replaced. Across the country, authors and filmmakers continued to immortalize him. They painted him in gold and shadow, half artist, half assassin. Each retelling added something new: the romantic, the visionary, the rebel, the cursed man. And in every version, Las Vegas glowed in the background like a lover he could never quite possess. It wasn't just his legacy, it was his afterlife. Tourists visiting the Flamingo decades later would sometimes stumble upon the small bronze plaque dedicated to him in the hotel's gardens. It sat quietly among the flowers, often unnoticed, engraved with simple words honoring his contribution to the city's founding. Beneath the desert sun, people took selfies beside it, unaware of the irony that they were smiling beside a memorial to a man who had died violently, betrayed by the very dream they had come to enjoy. The plaque was polite, understated, stripped of his madness and his fire. But those who knew the real story understood that no monument could capture him. He was not a statue to be admired. He was a storm that once tore through history, leaving light in its wake. The further Las Vegas expanded, the more its origins blurred. Skyscrapers replaced sand dunes, and digital screens drowned out the sound of coins clattering in metal trays. The city no longer needed the mob. It had become its own kind of machine. But even amid the skyscrapers and slot machines, there was something unshakably old about the place. Beneath the steel and glass, you could still feel the heartbeat of 1946, the pulse of a man who refused to bow to reason. As the 20th century drew to a close, nostalgia began to color the way people viewed the early mob years. Documentaries, podcasts, and museum exhibits celebrated the so-called golden age of organized crime. Siegel's name was always front and center. Scholars debated his legacy, psychologists dissected his personality, writers tried to explain what made him so different. None of them fully succeeded. He was not the kind of man who could be captured by logic. Bugsy Siegel was chaos refined into charm. His daughters grew up away from the violence, their lives marked by the shadow of their father's legend. They rarely spoke of him publicly, though once in an interview, one of them said quietly, "He wasn't a monster. He was just too alive." That phrase lingered, echoing through the years because it held the truth everyone else missed. Bugsy Siegel wasn't driven by greed or bloodlust. He was driven by life itself, by the intoxicating rush of creation, even when that creation led to destruction. He didn't crave power. He craved beauty, and beauty in his world always came with a cost. By the 2000s, Las Vegas had grown into a monument of contradictions, luxury and loneliness, light and emptiness, pleasure and despair. The city was built on hope but fueled by ruin. People came to escape, to forget, to lose, to win. And everywhere they went, from the grand halls of the Bellagio to the last dusty bar on Fremont Street, they were walking inside the dream of a man who once refused to believe the desert was dead. His fingerprints were still in the city's pulse, his madness hidden in the architecture, his ambition reflected in every polished surface. In truth, the story of Bugsy Siegel is the story of Las Vegas itself, born from the impossible, shaped by violence, and sustained by illusion. He had wanted to create something eternal, and he had succeeded, though not in the way he intended. Eternity, after all, rarely belongs to the living. It belongs to myths, and Bugsy Siegel had become one of the greatest myths America ever produced. Today, historians still visit the archives, sifting through yellowed papers and black and white photographs, trying to separate fact from fiction. They find contradictions everywhere. Some claim he stole millions from the mob. Others say he was framed. Some say Virginia betrayed him. Others swear she tried to save him. The truth lies buried beneath layers of loyalty, fear, and time. Perhaps it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that people still care enough to ask. In a world that forgets so easily, the fact that his name still provokes curiosity is proof of his immortality. The desert has a way of keeping its secrets. The winds that sweep across the Nevada sands carry echoes of the past, soft murmurs of deals struck and dreams lost. Sometimes, when the night is still and the air is dry, it feels as if you can hear footsteps crunching across the gravel, deliberate and confident. Some swear it's just the wind. Others say it's him, still walking toward a horizon no one else can see. There's an old saying among the dealers and pit bosses who've worked the Strip for decades. Bugsy built this town so God wouldn't find him. Maybe they're right. Maybe Las Vegas isn't just a city, it's a confession, a monument to the people who refuse to repent. And in that sense, Bugsy Siegel got what he wanted. He built a world where sin was survival, where beauty was carved from brutality, where light defied the darkness. He died for it, yes. But what greater victory could there be than to die for something that still shines long after you're gone? The story of Benjamin Siegel is not a cautionary tale. It's a mirror, one that reflects the most dangerous truth of all, that greatness and destruction often come from the same place. He wasn't good, and he wasn't evil. He was human, flawed, fiery, and unforgettable. And though the world has changed, his story remains carved into the bones of the desert, glowing every night in the lights that stretch endlessly into the black sky. He built a dream, and the dream outlived him. That's immortality. Decades had passed since the gunfire shattered the stillness of that June night in Beverly Hills. But even now, the legend of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel refused to die. The world had moved on, yet his story lived quietly between the folds of time, whispered in back rooms, retold in neon and smoke. For many, he had become less of a man and more of an idea, the embodiment of ambition unrestrained, a symbol of beauty born from chaos. And in some strange way, that was exactly what he had always wanted. He wanted to live forever, not through family or faith, but through myth. Las Vegas, his once cursed kingdom, had grown into something so massive and unreal that even he might not have recognized it. The Flamingo had long been rebuilt and reimagined, transformed from a blood-soaked gamble into a polished jewel of the Strip. The desert he had stared at with childlike wonder had become the most alive place on earth, a mirage made permanent. The streets pulsed with color and heat, alive with the music of slot machines and the laughter of strangers. And though most of them didn't know it, they were walking inside one man's dream, a dream that had demanded blood in exchange for glory. Historians tried to rationalize him, to fit him neatly into the framework of organized crime. They called him a gangster, an entrepreneur, a psychopath, a visionary, but none of those words truly fit. To call him a gangster was to reduce him to the dirt he rose from. To call him a businessman was to strip him of his madness, the very thing that made him extraordinary. He was a paradox, a killer who loved poetry, a brute who adored beauty, a man who found comfort not in order but in chaos. In a world ruled by hierarchy and fear, Bugsy Siegel lived by instinct, by passion, by the unrelenting belief that he could shape destiny with his own hands. Those who knew him best often said that he was too modern for his time. He saw things no one else could see. Luxury in sin, elegance in crime, art in the underworld. To him, money wasn't the goal. It was the paint he used to create something lasting. He wanted to build a kingdom of light in a world that had only ever offered him darkness. That, more than greed or ego, was his fatal flaw. Because dreams that big are always dangerous. Not just to others, but to the dreamer himself. In the years following his death, the mob tried to bury his memory. They didn't speak his name in meetings. They erased him from ledgers, from photographs, from history. To them, he had been a liability, a man who forgot that the world he lived in was built on silence and obedience. But erasure is a fragile kind of punishment. You can remove a name from a file, but not from a legend. And the more they tried to forget him, the louder his story became. Meyer Lansky, haunted by guilt and love in equal measure, spent the rest of his life balancing the empire they had built. He was the opposite of Bugsy, patient where Siegel was impulsive, cold where Siegel burned. Yet even he couldn't escape the ghost of his old friend. In interviews and private conversations, he spoke of Siegel as though he were still alive, as though somewhere in some other reality, Benny was still laughing, still scheming, still pacing the desert at night and talking about fountains and chandeliers. In one of his final years, when asked about the murder, Lansky only said, "We all lost something that night." He didn't mean money. He meant magic. Virginia Hill's life spiraled in the years that followed. She fled to Europe trying to outrun her past, but the past has a way of catching up, especially when it's written in blood. She lived in hotels under false names, haunted by headlines and memories. There were nights she'd wake up screaming, hearing the echo of gunfire that had ended the only man she had ever truly loved. Her beauty faded with time, but her eyes never lost their fire, the same fire that had once matched Siegel's. When she died years later, alone in Austria, the newspapers mentioned her as Bugsy Siegel's mistress, as though her existence had been an extension of his. But in truth, they had been reflections of each other, two volatile souls drawn together by passion and destruction, bound by a love too fierce for the world they lived in. The men who had ordered Siegel's death never found peace either. Some died in prison, others disappeared into quiet obscurity, but all of them carried the invisible stain of what they'd done. Killing a man like Bugsy wasn't like killing a rival or a snitch. It was like killing a force of nature. They had destroyed their own myth by silencing his. The irony was that in trying to protect their business, they had created a legend that would outlive them all. In time, even Hollywood couldn't resist his story. Films were made, books were written, each one painting him in a different light. Some made him a romantic hero, others a doomed madman. Each portrayal added another layer to the myth, another reason for the world to remember him. And perhaps that was the final twist of fate. The man who lived by illusion became immortal through it. Those who visit Las Vegas today see nothing of the old Flamingo that Siegel built. Yet his fingerprints are everywhere. They're in the grand arches, the velvet drapes, the fountains that dance under moonlight. They're in the sound of dice rolling, the flash of cards, the laughter of strangers chasing dreams that are always just out of reach. Every win and every loss, every light and every shadow carries a whisper of him. Bugsy Siegel didn't just build a casino, he built a stage, and the play never ended. There's a certain poetry in how history remembers men like him. Society loves to condemn them while secretly admiring them. We call them criminals, but we build cities on their dreams. We call them mad, but we follow their visions. And long after they're gone, we immortalize them as the very thing they always believed themselves to be. Exceptional. Bugsy understood this. That's why, even at his most reckless, he carried himself like a man performing for eternity. Every suit, every gesture, every word was deliberate. He didn't just want to live. He wanted to be remembered, and he got his wish. Sometimes, in the early hours of morning, when the desert winds sweep across the empty outskirts of Vegas, people say they can still see a figure walking along the old highway. Tall, sharp, a fedora tilted low. He stops to light a cigarette, looks toward the glowing city in the distance, and smiles. Some say it's just the heat playing tricks. Others swear it's him, still keeping watch over the empire he birthed from dust. Whether ghost or imagination, it feels right. Because if any man could defy death, it would be him. But there's something deeper beneath the legend, something quieter. Bugsy Siegel's story isn't just about ambition or power. It's about the human hunger for meaning. He was born into a world that told him he was nothing, that his life would be small and brutal. And he refused. He built something grand enough to make the gods jealous, something so dazzling it could make even the cruelest hearts believe in beauty. And for that, he paid the price. Yet if he were alive to see what his dream became, the billions spent, the endless lights, the millions who come seeking luck or love or escape, he'd probably laugh. Because beneath the skyscrapers and spectacle, the city still carries the same heartbeat he gave it. The rhythm of danger, seduction, and desire. The eternal hum of risk. That's what Las Vegas truly is. Not a city, but a confession. Every light is a prayer, every gamble a sin, every smile a mask. It's a place that promises everything and delivers nothing but reflection. The same mirror that Bugsy looked into his whole life. A mirror that showed him not what he was, but what he could be, if only he dared, and he did. History often measures men by what they built or destroyed. But Bugsy Siegel will always be measured by what he dreamed. He dreamed of a paradise in the desert and gave it life. He dreamed of class in chaos and gave it form. He dreamed of immortality, and though he never saw it with his own eyes, he achieved it all the same. There's an old photograph that circulates among mob historians, a grainy black and white shot of Siegel standing in front of the half-finished Flamingo, his hand on his hip, a cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. His eyes are half-shadowed, but the smirk on his face says everything. Behind him, the skeleton of his dream rises from the sand. He looks like a man at peace, a man certain that history is watching. Maybe he knew, even then, that he would never live to see it finished. Maybe he understood that the price for creation is destruction, that no one builds something eternal without offering a piece of themselves to it. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. He gave the desert his blood, and the desert gave him eternity. Every story of Las Vegas, every tale of glitz and ruin, begins with him. Every light that flickers against the horizon is a spark from his fire. Every gambler who walks through the doors of the Flamingo, knowingly or not, steps into his shadow. His body may be long gone, but his spirit remains, restless, relentless, forever chasing the next impossible dream. Because men like Bugsy Siegel don't vanish. They echo, and the echo, even now, still sounds like laughter under the Nevada sun.